The bar was loud, sticky with summer heat, and the last place Sloane Mercer wanted to be. 14 hours on her feet. 2 codes. One combative patient who'd thrown a bedpan at her head, and an attending physician who'd signed off on the wrong dosage until she caught it. All she wanted was a glass of water and a ride home. She got neither. The group of Navy SEALs in the corner had been drinking since sundown. When one of them spotted her scrubs and the St. Arden badge clipped to her jacket, the laughter started low, then got louder. "Just a nurse," the tall one said, loud enough for the whole bar to hear. "Acting like she's seen a real battlefield." Sloane didn't respond. She turned toward the door. That's when it happened. A Belgian Malinois exploded from beneath a corner table, 90 pounds of military-trained muscle, and shot straight toward her. The handler shouted. The dog ignored him completely. Sloane said one word, one old word from a life she didn't talk about anymore. "Heel." The dog sat down at her feet, like she was the only person in the room. The bar went silent. If you've ever been underestimated, at work or anywhere else, stay with this one. And if stories like this are your thing, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it means you won't miss the next one. The water never came. Sloane had already set her glass on the bar and was heading for the door when she heard it again. That particular kind of laughter. The kind that wasn't meant to be quiet. The tall SEAL, the one with the easy grin and the louder mouth, was saying something to the guy beside him. She caught the words scrubs and cute and playing dress-up. And she kept walking. She'd heard worse. She'd heard worse. From people who were bleeding out and still managed to get a dig in. She had learned a long time ago that you didn't win anything by turning around. But the dog had other ideas. She heard the scramble of claws on hardwood before she saw him. A Belgian Malinois coming off the floor like a spring uncoiling, bypassing every person between them as though they were furniture. The handler, a young corporal who looked barely old enough to drink, grabbed for the leash and caught nothing but air. The dog didn't growl. He didn't bark. He ran straight to Sloane and stood there, every muscle rigid, nose lifted, reading something in the air around her that no one else in that bar could detect. Sloane looked down at him. Something old moved through her chest. Not sentiment, not quite. More like recognition. The dog's name was stitched into his vest. Atlas. She knew that name. She said the word the way she used to say it, low and flat and certain. Heel. Atlas sat, square and immediate, pressed against her left leg, head up, waiting. No one in Harbor Line said anything for a long moment. The bartender stopped wiping the counter. The jukebox was between songs. The tall SEAL, the one who'd made the joke, was staring at the dog with an expression Sloane recognized as the moment a person realizes they've made a serious miscalculation. His name was Dax Fenner, and he was staring not just because the dog had listened. He was staring because Atlas had only ever listened to one person with that kind of certainty. A combat medic his unit had called Doc Mercer, someone who'd gone quiet after a mission years back, the way people sometimes went quiet. Reassigned, discharged, or something worse that nobody talked about in public. He'd never connected that name to a woman in scrubs waiting for a rideshare outside a bar in Ridgefall. In the far corner of the room, a man sat alone at a two-top table, with his back to the wall, and a beer he hadn't touched. He wore civilian clothes, dark jacket, no insignia. But he held himself the way people do when military posture becomes permanent, when the body forgets it's allowed to relax. His name was Reed Calder. He'd been back in Ridgefall for less than a week, and he'd chosen this particular bar because it was low lit and nobody knew his face here. He hadn't come to socialize. He'd come because this neighborhood sat 3 blocks from St. Arden Medical Center. And tomorrow morning, he had somewhere to be. He didn't turn around when Atlas bolted. But when he heard the command, one word, same cadence, same flat authority he'd heard in the dark on the worst night of his life, his hand closed around the beer glass and didn't let go. He didn't look. He didn't need to. Sloane left without speaking to Dax or to anyone else. She didn't explain herself, didn't acknowledge the stairs. She clipped the outside door shut behind her and stood in the heat of the parking lot until her ride appeared. She thought about the 14-hour shift. She thought about the wrong dosage she'd caught at 11 that night, and the look on Dr. Shaw's face when she'd corrected it. Not gratitude, not even neutrality, but the particular expression of a man who'd been embarrassed in front of a resident and intended to remember it. She thought about the meeting Tobias Klein had scheduled for Monday morning. Performance review, the calendar invite said, which was the language St. Arden used when they wanted to document a paper trail before doing something irreversible. She got in the car and went home. The call came at 6:47 the next morning. Multi-vehicle accident on the I-19 corridor. Armored transport involved 2 critical ETA 11 minutes. Sloane was already dressed. She made it to St. Arden's trauma bay before the first ambulance arrived and took her position without announcing it. Checked the supply cart, confirmed the decompression kit was stocked, and waited. The doors opened. The first patient came through. Fast, headlack stable, vitals alert. The second gurney was different. The paramedic calling it out was already talking over himself. Numbers running together. And Sloane was moving toward the cart before Dr. Shaw had finished processing the handoff. She looked at the patient's face. The world rearranged itself in the space of one breath. She knew the set of his jaw. She knew the scar beneath it, a jagged V-shape under the right side of his chin, pale against tan skin. She had made that scar. She had sutured that wound by feel in the dark, with her back against a blown-out wall and someone else's blood on her hands, using the last of the field kit because there hadn't been a second option. Reed called her. Unconscious now, oxygen saturation dropping. She could see the asymmetry in his chest movement from 3 feet away, the right side lagging the left, working too hard to compensate. Tension pneumothorax. Pressure building in the chest cavity, compressing the heart, buying him maybe minutes if no one moved. What she didn't know yet was why Reed had been in that armored transport at all. That would come later, in pieces, when he was conscious enough to tell her. What she knew right now was the only thing that mattered. He was dying on the table in front of her, and the clock was already running. She said it clearly to Shaw, to the room. He needs needle decompression. Right side, second intercostal space. Now! Shaw looked at the monitor. The numbers weren't alarming yet. That was the problem with tension pneumo. By the time the numbers became alarming, you were already behind. He's maintaining, Shaw said. We watch and wait. He won't be maintaining in 4 minutes. Shaw's expression was the same one from the night before. Not anger, but calculation. Mercer, step back. She knew what stepping back meant. She knew about the Monday meeting, about the file Klein was building, about the list she'd apparently been placed on without being told. She knew that if she touched this patient without Shaw's authorization, that file would close around her like a hand. Reed's blood pressure dropped 7 points in the span of one reading. Sloane reached for the kit. The needle went in clean. Sloane had done it enough times that her hands didn't consult her brain for permission anymore. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The specific resistance of tissue giving way, and then the sound, that unmistakable hiss of trapped air escaping. Reed's chest wall rose evenly on both sides, for the first time since they'd wheeled him in. His blood pressure climbed back. Not fast, but steady. The kind of steady that meant the intervention had worked, and the body was remembering what it was supposed to do. Shaw said nothing for 3 full seconds. The resident beside him was watching the monitor with the wide-eyed focus of someone filing everything away for later. Then Shaw stepped back from the gurney and looked at Sloane the way a man looks at something he has decided to deal with after the immediate crisis has passed. "Get him to OR 2, he said to the room. To Sloane, he said nothing at all. She already knew what the silence meant. Reed came out of surgery 3 hours later. The OR team had found the internal bleed she'd suspected, a lacerated intercostal vessel, that Shaw had initially attributed to impact bruising. The attending surgeon, a methodical woman named Dr. Paulette Graves, told the recovery nurse it had been closer than the chart would reflect. Charts in Sloane's experience rarely reflected how close things actually got. Sloane was filling out her incident documentation at a workstation near the end of the hall when Tobias Klein appeared. He brought the kind of quiet that preceded official language 2 HR staff members, trailing half a step behind, one of them holding a folder. Klein was a tall man who dressed like he wanted to be mistaken for a physician. He told Sloane she had performed an invasive procedure without attending authorization. He told her this represented a serious breach of protocol and a liability risk to the institution. He told her, in the careful syntax of a man who had done this before, that she was being placed on immediate administrative suspension pending a formal review. He also told her that her system credentials would remain active until the paperwork cleared. A procedural gap that would take until end of business to close. He said it as a bureaucratic footnote. Sloane noted it as something else entirely. She signed where they asked her to sign. Then she went to collect her bag. She was almost to the elevator when Dax Fenner walked through the main entrance with Atlas at his side. Dax wasn't in uniform. He looked like he hadn't slept. Atlas moved beside him with the attentiveness of a working dog that had been pulled off task and wasn't satisfied about it, scanning the lobby nose working until he found Sloane across 30 feet of linoleum and locked on. Dax stopped in front of her. He had the look of a man who had spent the night revising something he thought he knew. "I owe you an apology," he said. "From last night. What I said." "You don't need to do this here," Sloane told him. "I know who you are." His voice dropped. "Doc Mercer. I was a Lieutenant JG on the Ramadi rotation. You weren't attached to my platoon directly, but I knew your call sign. Everybody did." Sloane looked at him for a moment. There was nothing in his expression that resembled the man from the bar. No performance, no audience. Just someone trying to settle a debt he hadn't known he owed until 12 hours ago. "The man upstairs," Dax continued. "Reed Calder. He was your CO." "He was a patient," Sloane said. "He still is." "I can make some calls. People who can confirm your service record. If Klein is trying to build a case against you, we can shut it down before—" "No." Dax stopped. "If this hospital decides I was right about that patient," Sloane said, "I want it to be because I was right about the patient. Not because someone made calls. Not because of where I used to work." She looked down at Atlas, who was watching her with the steady focus of an animal that had made a decision and wasn't reconsidering it. "Take care of him," she said, meaning Reed. Then she walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the 3rd floor, because she wasn't done yet. Reed was awake, not fully, but enough. When Sloane came through the door, he turned his head toward her with a certainty that suggested he'd been expecting her specifically. She pulled a chair close and sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had once shared a different kind of silence, the operational kind, where talking was a liability. "I heard it was close," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation. "Closer than it needed to be," Sloan said. Reed's eyes moved to the ceiling. He breathed carefully, the way people breathe when breathing requires attention. I wasn't in that transport by chance, he said. I came to Ridgefall on purpose. Someone reached out to me, a former St. Arden employee. Respiratory tech, worked here 6 years. Name was Marcus Owen. He explained it slowly, conserving energy. Marcus had filed 3 internal reports about equipment failures, ventilators in the ICU behaving in ways consistent with a documented manufacturer defect, one that had triggered a recall notice. The hospital had never acted on. His reports were acknowledged and then buried. Shortly after his personnel file developed, documentation he'd never seen before, disciplinary write-ups, an attending's complaint, a record that had been clean for 6 years and was suddenly not. He resigned before they could fire him. Before he left the state, he forwarded everything he had to a contact he trusted. That contact passed it to Reed. I came to find out if it was one person with a grievance, Reed said, or something with a pattern. It's a pattern, Sloan said. He looked at her. You've already looked. Not yet, but I'm about to. She went back to a workstation on the 2nd floor while her credentials still worked. And she was deliberate about it, not searching blindly, but pulling the incident report index and cross-referencing it against the equipment maintenance logs and the vendor contract records she could access from the clinical dashboard. It took 40 minutes to see it clearly. The reports were their equipment malfunctions, medication sourcing, anomalies, near-miss events flagged by floor staff across 2 years. Each one had a resolution note, and in every case, she cross-referenced the original language had been revised. Device malfunction, attributed to manufacturer defect, had become improper operation by attending technician. Medication substitution not authorized by formulary committee had become dispensing error, staff counseled. The names attached to the original reports were nurses technicians, a pharmacist, 2 junior residents. In the revised versions, those same names had moved from the witness field to the responsible party field. It wasn't sloppy. It was careful. Each revision was small enough to seem like a clarification rather than a rewrite. And no single file told the whole story. You had to look at all of them together. Marcus Owen's file confirmed everything Reed had described. 6 years clean. Then 3 months of retroactive documentation that didn't align with any corresponding shift log entries. Someone had created paperwork for events that had generated no paperwork at the time they allegedly occurred. Near the bottom of Marcus's file, in a partially deleted internal message thread, Sloan found an email address in a carbon copy field. The domain wasn't hospital-affiliated. It ended in a suffix she recognized from government correspondence, not law enforcement exactly, but adjacent to it in a way that meant something. She wrote the address on the back of a supply requisition form, the nearest paper, and sat with it for a moment. Then she opened her personal email on her phone and typed 4 sentences. She gave her name, her nursing license number, the specific file reference numbers she'd found, and a single declarative statement. The incident documentation at St. Arden Medical Center had been systematically altered to reassign liability from institutional failures to individual staff members. She didn't ask for anything. She sent it and put her phone in her pocket. 30 seconds later, her system credentials expired mid-session and the screen went gray. By the following morning, the story moving through St. Arden was no longer about Reed Calder or the decompression procedure. The story was about Sloan. She heard it from a former colleague who texted from the break room. Not out of loyalty, but out of the discomfort people feel when they want someone to know something without being seen as the one who told them. Shaw had been making comments during morning rounds about Sloan's escalating behavior and her difficulty adjusting to civilian practice after a trauma-heavy military background. The phrase circulating in at least 2 conversations was, not psychologically stable. She read the text twice and put her phone face down on her kitchen table. She'd known this was a possible move. Her service record was the cleanest weapon available to someone who needed to discredit her quickly. A combat history could be reframed as damage. Clinical confidence could be reframed as recklessness. The colleagues who had once flagged her down in hallways to ask her opinion on a difficult patient were not texting her now. And she understood the arithmetic of institutional risk even when she found it hard to sit with. That afternoon, Bax brought Atlas to the 3rd floor. The dog was not supposed to be in the patient wing without prior approval, but no one on the nursing staff seemed prepared to tell a Navy SEAL that his canine needed to wait in the lobby. Atlas walked the hallway with deliberate attention, checking doors, and when he reached Reed's room, he stationed himself outside it like he'd been posted there. The staff noticed. You notice when an animal that operates on instinct and training decides without ambiguity who in the room deserves following. It wasn't anything a person could point to and argue with. It was just there, quiet and consistent, every shift. 2 days after the suspension, Reed's blood pressure dropped. It happened fast, one reading, then another. The numbers falling in a way that didn't match the expected post-surgical curve. The ICU nurse called it in, and Shaw responded. The working theory being fluid redistribution, something to monitor. Sloan was in the parking lot when Dax called her. He didn't explain how he'd gotten her number. He said Reed's pressure was dropping, and the team wasn't treating it as urgent. And something in his voice carried the specific register of a person who already suspects the answer and needs someone to confirm it out loud. She knew the profile before she'd finished listening. Post-surgical timeline, mechanism of injury, pattern of the pressure drop, cardiac tamponade. Blood accumulating in the pericardial sac, compressing the heart from outside. Looking like a routine complication, right up until it killed you. She drove back and went straight to the ICU. Shaw met her at the door with a security officer who had clearly been briefed. "You don't have access to this unit," Shaw said. "He has cardiac tamponade," Sloan said. "Pericardial effusion from the original trauma. It's been building since surgery. You need to drain it now." Shaw's expression was controlled in the way of someone managing a public situation. "Your privileges are suspended. Anything you say in this capacity carries no clinical weight." "Then treat it as an anonymous tip." "Security is going to walk you out." Down the hall, Atlas started barking. It wasn't aggression, and it wasn't alarm. It was sustained and deliberate, loud enough to pull 2 nurses from the station and stop a woman in a dark blazer who'd just stepped off the elevator from taking another step forward. The dog didn't move from Reed's door. He just kept going with the focused insistence of an animal communicating something that required no translation. The woman by the elevator was Dr. Lenore Vance, cardiac attending on her way to a consult in the adjacent unit. She had been at St. Arden for exactly 11 days, brought in as part of a departmental expansion, and she had not yet formed opinions about the politics of the floor. She had only formed opinions about cardiology. She heard what Sloan said. All of it. The timeline, the mechanism, the pressure pattern, the specific differential between tamponade and routine fluid redistribution. She heard it the way someone hears a clinical argument on its merits, because she had no other context to run it through. She looked at Shaw, then at Sloan. Then she walked into Reed's room. 40 seconds later, she came back out and told the nurse to get a pericardiocentesis tray. Shaw said her name in a warning tone. Dr. Vance said, "Get the tray," again, and the nurse went. The procedure took 11 minutes. Reed's pressure stabilized before they'd finished. Dr. Vance closed the kit herself, said something brief to the assisting resident, and came to the doorway where Sloan was still standing. "Whoever you are," Dr. Vance said, "you were right." Sloan nodded. Reed was alive. Shaw was somewhere behind her with the expression of a man watching his strategy develop a crack he hadn't budgeted for. An hour later, Klein's assistant sent a calendar notification to Sloane's personal email. The formal board review to terminate her employment had been moved to the following morning. Klein had decided not to wait. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning. Sloane arrived at 8:45. She signed in as a visitor at the security desk and waited on a bench near the elevator bank until someone from HR came to escort her up. The conference room on the 4th floor had a long table and windows that faced the parking structure. 8 people were already seated: board members, legal counsel, and a woman from the state licensing office Sloane didn't recognize. Tobias Klein sat at the head of the table, with a folder in front of him and the composed expression of a man who had counted his votes in advance. Shaw was to Klein's left, not quite meeting her eyes. Klein opened by thanking everyone for their time. Then he began in the measured cadence of institutional language. Unauthorized intervention pattern of insubordination, psychological fitness concerns, liability exposure. He had documentation for each point. The folder was thick, and some of what it contained predated the Reed-Calder case by months, which told Sloane this had been in preparation for longer than she'd realized. She sat across from him and listened without interrupting. She had learned to let people finish. In her experience, the longer someone talked, the more they revealed about what they were actually trying to contain. Klein was afraid of the incident reports. He didn't mention them, which was exactly the tell. Every piece of documentation he presented was oriented around the same fixed point. Sloane was the problem. Her judgment was unreliable. Anything she had flagged or escalated could be attributed to instability rather than accuracy. He was building a frame, and the frame needed to be sealed before someone started asking what it was designed to hold. He had just reached the section on psychological fitness when the conference room door opened. The woman who walked in was not tall, but she moved like someone who didn't need to be. Dark blazer, leather document case, 2 colleagues positioning themselves near the door with the efficiency of people who had done this before and found it worked better without announcement. She placed a federal data preservation order on the table in front of Klein before he had finished reading her credentials. Her name was Dana Rourke. This covers all electronic records, audit logs, and physical documentation associated with incident reporting, vendor contracts, and personnel files at this facility for the past 36 months, she said. Any modification, deletion, or transfer made after the timestamp on that order will be treated as obstruction. Klein looked at the document. His expression didn't collapse, but it changed to subtle internal recalculation, the look of a man revising numbers he'd thought were already settled. Rourke sat without being invited and placed a second set of papers on the table. My team has been monitoring this facility's vendor relationships and internal reporting activity for approximately 7 months. 2 nights ago, we received a communication from a staff member that provided specific file reference numbers matching anomalies we'd already flagged independently. She looked briefly at Sloane, not with warmth, but with the directness of someone acknowledging a fact. That communication accelerated our timeline considerably. The 4 sentences Sloane had sent into the dark had landed somewhere after all. What Rourke's team had recovered was not a simple matter of one administrator falsifying a few files. The log restoration completed overnight showed coordinated revision spanning more than 2 years. Klein's credentials appeared in the access history at the points of highest consequence. Shaw's appeared less frequently, but at critical junctures. The moments when a report moved from preliminary to final, from flagged to closed, from systemic failure to individual error. The vendor angle was the fulcrum of it. St. Arden had switched its primary equipment supplier 26 months ago, moving to a company offering a significantly lower contract rate. What the board had not been told was that the product line had already accumulated regulatory complaints in 2 other states. When the failures began appearing at St. Arden, ventilator irregularities, infusion pump calibration errors, a surgical instrument lot with a documented contamination issue, the internal reports that should have triggered a formal review, instead generated documentation pointing at the people who'd filed them. Marcus Owen's file was in the recovered data. So were the files of 4 other former employees, each showing the same construction, a clean record, then a rapid accumulation of retroactive disciplinary notes, then a departure. 2 had signed non-disclosure agreements on the way out that Rourke's team was already reviewing. Klein said carefully that he would need to consult with legal counsel before responding. Rourke said that was his right. She also said that 2 of her colleagues were currently in the records room on the 2nd floor, and 2 more were with the IT department, so the practical window for consultation was somewhat compressed. Patricia Hallwell, a board member who had served St. Arden for 9 years and had clearly not signed up for federal exposure, asked Rourke directly what the full scope of the investigation covered. Rourke answered her directly. The vendor contract, the altered documentation, the wrongful termination patterns, and 3 patient deaths that had occurred within the window of confirmed equipment failures, and whose records had been subsequently revised. The room was quiet after that, in a way that was different from the quiet before. Shaw spoke for the first time since Rourke had entered. His voice had lost the clinical authority it carried in all ways. I wanted on record that my involvement was limited to personnel matters. The vendor decisions were above my level. No one wrote anything down because Rourke's colleague near the door had been recording since they arrived, and Shaw apparently registered this a moment after speaking because he stopped and didn't continue. A piece of evidence that had not been in Rourke's original file was presented near the end of the meeting. Security footage from Harborline, pulled as part of the broader documentation package. The timestamp was the night before Reed Calder's accident. On screen, a Belgian Malinois in a military service vest broke from his handler, crossed a crowded bar, and sat down at the feet of a woman in nursing scrubs at the sound of a single command. One of the board members asked what the footage had to do with the investigation. Rourke explained that Klein's personnel file on Sloan included a notation sourced from Shaw's comments during rounds, suggesting that Sloan had fabricated or exaggerated her military background to lend herself credibility. The footage, combined with the sworn statement from Dax Fenner submitted that morning, established her service record as documented fact. It closed the psychological fitness angle entirely. Dax was not in the room. He had submitted his statement in writing, and at the bottom of it, beneath his signature, he had added a single line that wasn't legal language. It said, "I made a judgment about this woman before I looked at her. I was wrong. The record should reflect that." The meeting dissolved rather than concluded. Klein was escorted from the building before Sloan reached the lobby, the process moving with the quiet efficiency of something that had been prepared in advance and needed only the right moment to execute. Dax was in the lobby with Atlas. He'd been there since 8:30. When Sloan came out of the elevator, Atlas stood. Dax looked at her with the expression of a man who had finished revising something and was ready to hand it over. "Rourke's team reached out to us 2 days ago," he said. "Asked us to confirm details about a former operational medic. We weren't briefed on the full scope." He stopped. "I should have seen it at the bar. I looked at your badge and I stopped looking." "Most people do," Sloan said. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He nodded. There was something in his expression that was trying to be equal to the moment and not quite getting there, which she respected more than if he'd managed it easily. Some things shouldn't be easy to stand in front of. She went up to see Reed that afternoon after Rourke's team had finished their preliminary interviews, and the 4th floor had taken on the atmosphere of an institution that had just had its internal logic interrupted. Reed was sitting up, more color in his face than she'd seen since the trauma bay. He had the focused quality of someone whose analgesic fog had cleared enough to let him be fully himself again. "Rourke brief you?" he asked. "She briefed the room," Sloane said. "I was in it. Marcus is being contacted today. The others, too." He shifted carefully against the pillow. "It won't undo what happened to them, but the record gets corrected. It's something. It's more than they had yesterday." He looked at her with the directness that had always been his defining quality. Not warmth exactly, but a total absence of pretense. "You sent that email." "I sent 4 sentences to an address I found in a deleted message thread. I didn't know if anyone would read it." Rourke's team had been watching this facility's communications for months. When a message came in from an active staff member, with specific file references matching their internal flags, they moved it up the chain inside of 6 hours. Something in his expression settled. "You handed them the thread to pull." Outside the window, a helicopter was crossing the sky toward the trauma center, moving fast, carrying someone towards something urgent. Sloane watched it until it cleared the frame. "The 3 patients," she said. "The deaths. Their families are being notified." His voice stayed even, but it cost something. "That part doesn't get better. It just gets acknowledged." She stayed until he was ready to sleep, then left without making it into a moment. 3 weeks later, Sloane walked back into St. Arden through the main entrance, and the turnstile read her badge and opened without hesitation. Klein's office had a temporary nameplate while the board conducted an executive search. Shaw's privileges were suspended, pending the licensing review. Dr. Vance had stepped into a temporary leadership role in the emergency department, a natural extension of what she'd been doing since the day she'd walked into Reed's room and asked for a pericardiocentesis tray, and the staff had adjusted to her authority with the ease of people recognizing something that fit. The unit Sloane had been asked to lead was new. A rapid response structure sitting outside the traditional hierarchy, designed so that any clinical staff member could escalate a patient safety concern directly without routing it through the chain of people who might have reasons to redirect it. She hadn't asked for the role. It had been offered by the interim board chair after a 40-minute conversation that was equal parts interview and negotiation. She said yes because the alternative was returning to the same floor, same structure, same dynamics. And she'd already seen where that led. Not just for herself, for Marcus Owen, for the 4 other names in those files, for the 3 patients whose families were now learning things they should have been told much sooner. On Reed's discharge day, Dax brought Atlas to the 3rd floor. The dog moved through the hallway, and the staff gave him room not out of fear, but out of something closer to acknowledgement. Atlas had been present on this floor during the worst of it. Consistency over time earns its own kind of standing, even for an animal. Reed was dressed and ready when Sloane came in, discharge paperwork signed, sitting on the edge of the bed, with the settled quality of someone who has decided what comes next. He looked at her and said simply, "Thank you." "You already thanked me," Sloane said. "Years ago." "That was for a different thing." "Same skill set." He almost smiled. It was enough. Dax was in the doorway with Atlas beside him. As Sloane turned to leave, 3 members of Dax's team appeared from the waiting area. She hadn't heard them arrive. They stood without being arranged into it, not quite at attention, but close enough that the posture was legible. Dax placed his right hand over his chest. The others did the same. It wasn't a salute. It was quieter than a salute. It was the gesture of people who had found a way to name a debt that didn't fit inside the usual language offered to a woman who had never asked them to notice her at all. Sloane looked at them for a moment. She thought about the bar, about the word, just how a single syllable can be used to reduce a person to a fraction of what they are. She thought about all the mornings she had walked into St. Arden, carrying a history she'd never advertised, doing work she believed in for patients who would never know everything she brought into the room with her. She thought about Marcus Owen packing up his desk, about 4 other people who'd done the right thing and paid for it in ways that had taken years to name. She nodded once. Her pager went off the new unit's alert system, a rapid escalation call from the emergency department. She turned toward the stairs because they were faster than the elevator, and behind her, Atlas sat down in the middle of the hallway and watched her go. Nobody called her just anything. She was already running. The people who save lives quietly, who catch the mistake no one else caught, who speak up when it costs them something. They don't always get a moment like Sloane's, but they deserve one. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories about the people who do what's right when it's hardest, follow along. The next one is already coming.